G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to show you how you can instantly improve your hip extension range of motion. And having full range of motion into hip extension is really important for a whole range of different reasons, which we'll get into in another video. But the main reason why I want to touch on this today is that if you are missing hip extension, or more specifically, you are tight in the specific areas that limit hip extension, then these same areas consistently pop up in a raft of other musculoskeletal dysfunctions that we might see clinically as physiotherapists. So I want to give you 5 things that you can try that each in their own way should instantly improve your ability to extend your hip and restore some more normal function to that hip area. So a great place to start with any exercise that tries to instantly improve your hip extension range of motion is with something like a kneeling hip flexor stretch. And we want to target those hip flexors specifically because the hip flexor muscles generally attach from the front of your thigh into the front of your pelvis and also the front of your lower back. So your ability to take your leg or your knee behind you or behind the line of your trunk can be heavily dependent on how loose and mobile the tissues are at the front of your hip. So the kneeling hip flexor stretch essentially requires you to be kneeling up nice and tall and gently taking your hips forward as far as you feel comfortable without tilting backwards or without leaning forwards, trying to stay as vertically as you can and going as far as you feel comfortable until you feel some tension at the front of your hip. Now obviously if kneeling on one knee is too challenging for you, please have a pillow underneath you. You can also do this in standing as well, in the same position where you have your leg behind you. But the secret to any version of this stretch that you want to do is that once you've found the best version of that stretch going forwards, we also want to make sure that you're going off in different directions, either out to the side a little bit or out to the inside, or even you can play around with different foot positions, whether you rotate it outwards a little bit or rotate it inwards a little bit, to try and find the best access to whatever version of your tightness you can find at the front of that hip. Once you've made it very specific, the next thing that you need to do is you need to tense that tightness for about 5 to 10 seconds. You may also need to tense the muscles in your glutes as well. Just get your brain involved so that when you stop tensing, it creates this reflex where the tissue physically gives straight away. And the reason why this is so effective is that once you do relax and while maintaining this position, you should then feel you can instantly go further again than what you could before. So what we need you to do is keep repeating that process of squeezing this tight muscle, squeezing everything in the area for 5 to 10 seconds, relaxing, going further, repeating, going further and further until either you get sick of it or you've stopped making change. And then the second exercise that you can do to improve your hip extension range of motion immediately is the couch stretch. Now, if you've been a fan of the channel for a while, you'll know how important I find this exercise is in order to reclaim important hip extension range of motion, but also feed that slack back into your lower back and down into your knee. This is such a crucial exercise because it allows your hip, your knee, and your back to function better straight away. But the couch stretch can be a brutal stretch if you're not used to it. So I would recommend that you do this on a chair first and work your way down towards this shape that I'm about to show you, because it is a little bit more advanced than doing it on a couch or a chair. So how we want to do this is we want to essentially take the leg back, place your knee into the base of the wall where it meets the floor. We then want to place your foot up into this high sort of lunge type position. And from here, keeping your belly tight, keeping yourself braced, keeping your back straight, we want to inch up as far as you feel comfortable extending through your hip. We want to make sure that you're not extending through your back, especially if you're not taking the tension through the front of your hip here. But much like the kneeling hip flexor stretch, once you've found some pretty genuinely terrible or tight musculature through the front of your hip or even down into the front of your thigh, we again want to squeeze everything as best as you can for 5 to 10 seconds. As always, just get your brain involved so that when you stop tensing it, the muscle will give a little bit, it will relax immediately to some degree, which should then mean that you can go a fraction further back into the stretch than what you could before. But again, if this position itself is too challenging for you, you can do the same thing here on a chair where this knee goes into the back of the chair where it meets the seat. It's much less taxing on the musculature of your hips and thighs, but it is a great place to start and an important tool for you to use if you're trying to instantly improve that hip extension range of motion. So once you spend some time targeting some of the muscular restrictions that might be there at the front of that hip and the front of that thigh, we also need to take into account what might be happening at the deeper hip joint capsule at the front of that hip. So for anyone unaware, a hip joint capsule is essentially a fibrous bit of tissue that surrounds the joint, that ball and socket joint. Much like if you put that ball and socket joint into like a plastic wrap and wrap that joint up nice and tightly. Based on a number of things that we tend to do day to day in this modern world, the front of that hip can get tight. And if that is the case for you, then any muscular stretching that you might actually be doing may ultimately not be as effective as you'd like it to be, because deeper to those tight muscles might might be a mechanical handbrake or a restriction that you specifically need to target in order to improve that hip extension range of motion. So a really helpful way to target any stiffness through that anterior hip joint capsule is by using a power band or a band of some sort, hooking it through the back of the hip and then pushing you into hip extension a little bit more than what it would otherwise. So how this looks is if you can get a band, place your leg into the band and have the band right up into the top of your hip. We want to have the band high up in the top of that thigh, basically where the crease is of your glutes. Again, in that high kneeling position, again, that kneeling hip flexor stretch position, we want to make sure that we're coming as far back as possible with enough tension on the band that it's really forcefully pulling you forwards. The same as the kneeling hip flexor stretch. We want to be up nice and tall, belly nice and tight, and then lunging forwards or coming forwards through your hips, looking for a very specific tightness around the crease at the front of your hip. Again, we don't want you to arch backwards too much. We don't want you to lean forwards too much. We want you to specifically target the direction that you feel gives you the most access to some of that tightness. So for me, if I create a little bit of rotation outwards, I find that really winds up my hip enough to find a fantastic stretch through the front of that hip. I want to make sure that my butt is squeezed to keep my hip in a good position, but essentially we either want to oscillate backwards and forwards into that further hip extension range to ask that hip capsule at the front to specifically loosen and mobilize in this position. Or we can hang out here for 30 seconds or a minute. Same thing that we did before. We can tense everything, make it all tight. If there's any muscular restrictions on top of this, again, actively engaging that muscle, holding it for 5 seconds, then relaxing. You might find it'll allow you to go instantly a little bit further than what you could before. We want to keep repeating this process, whether you're oscillating or hanging out here, for a minute to 2 minutes to really encourage that anterior hip joint capsule to give you instant access or more instant access to some of that dormant hip extension range of motion that you may not necessarily be able to get if we don't add a band or a TheraBand of some sort to specifically bias that anterior hip joint capsule as well. So as you begin to remove some of the layers of muscular tightness or hip joint capsular tightness at the front of the hip that might be restricting you into that hip extension range of motion, what we can also add into the mix here to be even more thorough is if you can find a ball of some sort, and what we can do is we can go hunting through the tissue at the front of the hip to see if there's any other soft tissue, whether it be fascial restrictions, muscular tightness, it doesn't matter what it is. We're looking for something that feels tight and tender. If you can find the hip bone at the front of your hip, that can be a really great landmark to work from. Where that hip bone is at the front, if you come below that, you'll hit some of the hip flexor tissue, you'll hit some of your quad tissue, some of that TFL. It doesn't matter what the name of the muscle is. And we're going to gently use some techniques to encourage that tissue to give, again, to help you restore that dormant hip extension range of motion. If you come inside of that hip bone, you're definitely going to target some of those deeper hip flexor tissues. So like we've been doing, if you can find a spot here that feels particularly tight or tender, you have options. You can just let the ball gently press in here, like trigger point therapy. Again, this also creates a reflexive response that asks that tissue to instantly release and become less restricted straight away. But the other thing that we can do is if you want to get tight again, squeeze the tissue, squeeze your butt cheek, squeeze everything you can in that hip area, hold that for 5 to 10 seconds. Again, when you relax, it'll give, you'll feel like the ball may sink in a fraction deeper straight away, and then just keep repeating that process until you feel like you've stopped making change or you've had enough and you want to move on to something else. We can also incorporate movement into the mix to try and really ask that tissue to shear free a little bit faster. Because we're trying to improve hip extension, it doesn't hurt to find a really tight spot, then gently move into that hip extension range. Just see if you can floss or shear free some of that restriction by incorporating the movement that we're actually trying to improve by doing this exercise. So one final exercise I think you should absolutely try to immediately improve that hip extension range of motion is we want to put you in a position that requires hip extension but fatigues you at the same time. Because if you've been working hard to improve that hip extension range of motion, but you don't then use it in a way that's meaningful to your body, then the results may not be as permanent or as long lasting as we want them to be. Because I don't want you to do these exercises every single day for the rest of your life. I want you to do them to a point where you feel fantastic, but then you move in a way that uses that range of motion and cultivates that range of motion long term. And again, a really simple way to do this is just with a lunge or a lunge adjacent type shape. Again, if you can stand up once more, and the leg that we're going to try and bias is the one that you want to take back again into that hip extended position. position, the further away your feet are, the more potential you have to include that hip extension range into this exercise. Now, the key to a good lunge isn't necessarily lunging forwards like a lot of people tend to do intuitively. It's actually dropping your back knee down and coming back up again. We want your trunk to be up nice and tall. Again, we want your foot back as far as you feel comfortable. We also want to make sure that your back foot doesn't rotate outwards, because if it does, it takes some of the tension off the front of that hip and doesn't make it as much of a specifically hip extended position. If you can try and keep that back foot square with your front foot, and from this position, again, dropping down as deep as you feel comfortable, we can then start to utilize some of this range that you've just worked so hard to reclaim. Another great tip is to make sure that you squeeze your bottom, to make sure that these glute muscles know what they're doing, because they can often be inhibited by lack of range in this area. We can then take you into more and more hip extension to really try and bias that and strengthen the muscles, get your brain used to being in an extended position, why it's working and why it's trying to improve that range and keep it there long term. And the best thing about doing a lunge type exercise with a bias on that extended hip position is that engaging those muscles in that position will also help make you feel looser into that range as well. And so, as always, it's not a Your Wellness Nerd video if we don't try and talk about why those tissues have become tight in the first place. Because as we're always trying to promote here, if you're working hard trying to reclaim lost mobility or reclaim missing strength or better positions and shapes, there has to be something about the way that you live your life or you do the things that you do that is behind the scenes begun to rob you of that basic function and that basic capacity that you deserve to have. And so the number one reason why I find clinically that we tend to become stiff into that hip extension range of motion is that we tend to sit far too long and far too often throughout the day. And the reason why sitting tends to be the limiting factor here, or potentially the limiting factor for most people, is that we're often stuck in this hip flex position. And if you're someone who sits for most of the day at your desk, if you have to drive long distances, if you're spending a ton of time on a computer, if you're using your phone a lot, even if you like to sit down and watch TV over night time, if we're consistently in this sort of forward hip flex position and aren't often getting that knee extended behind ourselves like we would if we were walking or running or even sort of relatively standing upright, then it becomes easy for those tissues to become stiff into that range because we're not asking our tissues to express that natural range of motion. So your body tends to prioritize its resources somewhere else because we're not telling it that we value that shape over time. So it goes without saying that if you're working hard to improve your hip extension range of motion, we need to pair it up with some form of a lifestyle change or an awareness that you may not have had previously about where you might be losing some of that hip extension range of motion to again make sure that the path through this process becomes ultimately a lot smoother and that you're not back here again in 6 weeks or 6 months because everything's tightened back up again. So I genuinely hope that was helpful as always. If it was, please let me know down in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. But as always, I genuinely hope that helps you instantly improve your hip extension range of motion.